Do you want to master your French language skills and sound more like a native? Today we're going to be looking at 5 of the most common mistakes that people make when learning French and how you can avoid them so that you can sound as fluent as possible. Welcome back to Learn French with me, Amelia. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so that you don't miss a single video. So what are some of the most common mistakes that people make when learning French? We'll go through each example one by one so that by the end of the video you'll sound a lot more confident and more like a native. So first up, and one of the most common mistakes that I see people make is mixing up these 2 crucial French verbs. And those are avoir and être, to have and to be. So for example, to say I am 30 years old in French, we don't use the verb être, to be. Instead we use the verb avoir, to have. J'ai 30 ans, I have 30 years old. Sounds simple, but it'll be a dead giveaway that you're new to the language if you don't master this early on. This is a really crucial structure to remember as it crops up quite a lot in French. So for example, to say I am hot, physically I am hot temperature-wise in French, again, we do not use the verb être. Instead, we use the verb avoir, and that gives us j'ai chaud instead of je suis chaud, which means something completely different. Again, this same structure crops up when we want to say I'm hungry. Instead of saying I am hungry using the verb être, we use avoir, j'ai faim. I have hunger, quite literally. Are you getting the pattern? So let's move on to another example of another common mistake that people make when learning French. So for number 2, kind of similar to number 1, avoid directly translating words into French. For example, there are many English words that have French counterparts that sound and look the same, but the reason I call them counterparts is because they're actually false cognates. They do not mean the same thing in English as they do in French. And we call these false cognates. Actuellement, for example, does not mean actually, it means currently, right now in French. To say actually in French, we can say en fait or en réalité. Similarly, the verb passer in French does not translate to mean to pass in English. So if we say passer un examen in French, this does not mean to pass as in to succeed an exam like we would use it in English. What this means rather is the simple fact of sitting the exam or taking the exam. If you want to say that you have passed the exam as in you've succeeded it in French, you can say j'ai réussi l'examen, with réussir meaning to succeed. There are many examples of false French cognates out there, so just be careful. If a word looks similar, it might not mean what you think it is. Moving on to our 3rd of the most common French mistakes, we're now turning to pronunciation, which always trips a lot of people up. As you're probably already familiar with French, words don't always sound the way that they look. And by that I mean we don't necessarily pronounce every single letter, and this is certainly true for the endings of French words. So for example, a lot of French words that end in E, we don't pronounce the ending of the words, like la salle or la table or la fille. Similarly, many consonants we don't pronounce at the end of French words, so D, P, S, T, X, Z, like trop or chez or grand. However, if we add an E to the end of grand, we then do pronounce the D, making it grande. And this is just because in French, for every rule there is an exception, so you just have to become familiar with when we do and when we don't pronounce things. But as a general rule of thumb, generally the ending of words we don't pronounce. Moving on, 4thly, knowing when to use reflexive verbs is crucial to sounding exactly like a native. One of the most common things I notice language learners doing is using reflexives wrongly or not using them at all, because it is very easy to forget them as we don't have this form in English in the same way that they do. So one of the most common examples that you're probably familiar with is how to say I get up in the morning, and we cannot just simply translate this with lever, which means to get up. We have to add in the reflexive. This then becomes je me lève, with the me being the reflexive part for me. This translates to, quite literally, I get myself up. And so instead of the verb being lever, it becomes se lever, with that reflexive part added in. And this is really crucial to remember, as it doesn't really make sense if you just say je lève à 6 heures du matin, for example. You've got to say je me lève à 6 heures du matin. I get myself up. As a rule of thumb, reflexive verbs are often used when we do something to ourselves. Again, like I said, there are often exceptions in French, but this is a good general rule to be familiar with. For example, to say I've broken my arm, you can say je me suis cassé le bras. And that quite literally is translated as I myself broke my arm. So knowing when to use these structures and when to not use them is really crucial to getting it correct and sounding more like a native. And finally, one of the most common mistakes that I see French learners make is either not using the subjunctive when it needs to be used or using it incorrectly. And the subjunctive is a really tricky one, and mastering it will make you sound a lot more natural and closer to a native, definitely. It really will be a giveaway that you are a learner if you don't use it correctly. As French people, they have it drilled into them since early school when you use the subjunctive and when you don't use it. And often it is just a case of learning when to use it and when you don't. There are lots of rules for when you're supposed to use them, but sometimes these rules can be a bit blurry. So I would say, again, as a general rule of thumb, just learn the most common examples of when you are supposed to use them, and I will give you a couple now. So first thing to note is that the subjunctive is a mood and not a tense, and we could go into a whole separate video about how that works. But most commonly, when we are talking and saying something that involves some sort of desire for something, most commonly like I want something, this would then cause us to have to use the subjunctive afterwards. Let me tell you how. So if we say, for example, I want you to be here, that is a desire. My desire is to have you here. So in French, we'll say je veux, and then afterwards this is going to cause us to have to use the subjunctive form of être, giving us je veux que tu sois là, instead of tu es là. See the difference? And this is something that French people won't consciously be making a decision over. Oh, should I use a subjunctive now or should I not? This is just something that, like I said, is drilled into them since school. They will just know to use it after je veux in most cases. Again, there are a lot of exceptions in French, but you definitely use it here. So tu sois is the second person singular subjunctive form of être, and I know that sounds really complicated, but the best thing to remember is just that if you say something like I want you to be here or I want you to do something, if you are using you or us or a person, you are going to be using that subjunctive form for être instead of est, for example. Another example that I can give you, fairly similar to the je veux, is je suis contente que tu sois là. Again, we are using the subjunctive there instead of using est. And no, contente, I am happy that you are there. It's not a desire specifically, but this is just one of those cases where you do definitely use the subjunctive. Again, another one of those cases where you just use it even if it doesn't entirely make sense to you is when we say avant que, before something happens. You will always use the subjunctive after saying avant que. So for example, if I want to say, I'm going home before it gets dark, you can say, je vais rentrer avant qu'il fasse nuit. Fasse is that subjunctive form of faire. Instead of saying avant qu'il fait nuit, we're going to say avant qu'il fasse nuit. And again, this is just one of those times that we use this because this is where you use it. So that's why I say it's really good to familiarise yourself with these examples where you just know that it's going to cause you to have to use a subjunctive rather than trying to learn the subjunctive form of every single verb, because there will be a lot of verbs that you won't come across very often. But faire here, using it with avant que, that is something that you're probably going to use a lot. So it's good to familiarise yourself with the subjunctive form of it. Now, I hope going through those has helped you understand and pinpoint your errors and how you can learn from them. Remember, it's all about learning little and often, correcting those errors early on so that you don't make them later on, trust me. And just keep topping up your knowledge reserve so that you'll feel super confident. If you've enjoyed this video, give it a big thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll be going through even more French related stuff. So I'll see you then. Bonne continuation!